All right, hello Bengals fans. This is Anthony Cosenza with Cincy Jungle in the first episode of the new podcast for the website, the Orange and Black Insider. I'm joined with a couple of fellow Cincy Jungle writers and Cincy Jungle podcasters. I'll introduce them in just a second, but we are excited to bring you this new podcast to talk all things Bengals. Obviously, we're coinciding the first episode with training camp kicking off this weekend, so we're very, very excited about that. I'm very excited to have both Connor Howe and Scott Schultz with me to launch this new project in Cincy Jungle. I think we're going to have a great time. Obviously, we have some of the most engaged readers and listeners on our website, so very excited about that. Before I get to my co-host here, just a little background on the show. Obviously, Cincy Jungle has had a great podcast, a great Bengals podcast, under its umbrella for the past 2 or 3 years. My good friend Nick Suberling ran a show called Inside the Jungle, and we were blessed to have that on our website for a number of years. It's a great show. Nick has since been involved in a number of other projects, including a new FC Cincinnati soccer podcast. So if you are a fan of the other football sport, go check out his new podcast. But he's done a great job. Unfortunately, that show has ended after 200-plus episodes. It had a great run. I was part of that show, and like I said, we were blessed enough to have it on our website for a number of years. And now the time has come for a new podcast. We've got some new members of Cincy Jungle with our team, and with that podcast moving on, it's time for a new podcast. We're very excited to launch the Orange and Black Insider. You can follow this podcast on Twitter at Bengals OBI, so check that out. We'll be also posting these episodes on our Cincy Jungle website that you can stream either the audio or the video and audio if you want to see our beautiful faces every week. So check that out. Now, I'm going to introduce my co-hosts because you may or may not know them, or you may know them by name only because of their great work writing on the website. So I'll start with Scott, who's been a little bit of the man behind the curtain a little bit for Cincy Jungle. Scott Schultz, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got involved with Cincy Jungle, your path to maybe being a Bengals fan and getting into analyzing the team, and anything else you think our listeners should know about you.
Okay, just kind of briefly, I was raised a good homer, so love the Reds, love the Bengals. I'm the one member on this podcast who lives in Ohio, so I just always had it in my blood. Always loved watching the Bengals draft. We grew up more of a baseball family, so I actually was more of a Reds fan growing up, and it probably didn't help that my dad went to a high school that didn't have football, so we never really followed it too closely. But they were always kind of our team. When we followed a team, it was always the Bengals. We liked to root for them against the Browns and so forth. But I got into fantasy football about 10, 15 years ago, and that just really brought my interest back to the NFL, kind of ramped it up. And then based on that, I started following the Bengals a little more, probably late 90s, early 2000s, and actually found Cincinnati Jungle because of the Reds website, the Red Reporter they have online.
Yep.
I was looking up something on there, and I thought, what if they have a Bengals one? And found the Bengals one, just loved it. I was really impressed. I thought the posts were great, the fan posts were great, the dialogue was great. It was just a very wonderful forum to discuss everything Bengals. Like, I just fell in love with it. And I think for a while, until I became an actual author, I think every year I was rated as like one of the top fan post generators. Not rated as good, but rated in quantity. So I was a very high quantity commenter and poster for a long time. Just really loved it, really thought it was a wonderful environment, and one thing led to another, and now I'm here.
Excellent. Well, as I said, you do excellent work on the site, and some of the more creative posts that we have on our site, and actually the last segment of this show is probably going to be based on a recent series that you've been doing for the website. So awesome stuff on the website. Really glad you're part of the podcast, Scott. I appreciate you joining us. I'm going to go now to my fellow West Coaster. You're welcome. Coaster, Connor Howe, who has been writing for the Bengals for a couple of different sites for a little while now. He's also been doing some Facebook Live stuff with me for Cincy Jungle. So, Connor, why don't you give our listeners a little bit of background about yourself and some of the things maybe you specialize in on our website?
Yeah, well, I've kind of just been all around the internet, all over the place. My work's been kind of everywhere. But I joined Cincy Jungle after being editor of another Bengals blog in, I would want to say October, had a little stint, and then kind of came back in full swing in February, and that's kind of been, since February, I've kind of been just writing Bengals stuff all day, every day, seemingly. So I've been a Bengals fan since I was in eighth grade, I believe, maybe a little earlier. So about, I want to say like about 10 years, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. Probably on the more side, I'm guessing. I can't do the math in my head right now, but yeah, I grew up. I would say a Charger fan. I'm from San Diego. Uh, got really frustrated with the team's lack of direction and chose another team which I thought had direction at the time, and exciting players in the Bengals. I still like the Chargers, but I just fell in love with the Bengals and I've loved them ever since. I love to write about them, love to read about them. And on the site, I would say I don't really specialize in anything. I kind of just write whatever needs to be written. But I would say that one thing that I really think that I do pretty well is just write opinion-based articles and really present my opinion. I've written some pretty like one-sided posts specifically about Vontaze Burfict's suspension, about other NFL disciplinary policies, and debating about, well, is this player a top player? Is he a mid-tier player? What needs, like, why is everyone wrong? Why is everyone right? Kind of just embracing the debate. So I'm excited to go into the podcast form and really embrace the debate with other people and in real life pretty much. So yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, good to have you with us, and obviously fellow West Coaster, so I'm stoked on that. And for those who don't know me, I've actually been with the site since spring of 2011, if you can remember that. I joined the site when the Bengals were in a complete upheaval. They didn't know really who their quarterback was going to be, and they predict some people predicted them to go winless in that 2011 season. There was a strike, or not really a strike. There was that the dispute between the league and the NFLPA for all of that stuff going on. So I joined the site at a really weird time for Cincinnati Bengals. Like you, Scott, I was doing some fan post stuff and commenting a lot, and some of the people there, I must have grabbed their attention, and it's now been, like I said, probably now into summer of 2016, and I'm still writing, podcasting, doing all kinds of things for the site. So obviously I enjoy doing it, and I like the site. Otherwise I wouldn't be there for so long. So that's a little bit about us for those kind of tuning in. If you don't really know too much about us or read much of our material, I hope you continue to do to pay attention to what we do at Cincy Jungle and pay attention to our writers' material. So all of that being said, now that we got the pleasantries out of the way, the background out of the way, this weekend the Bengals kick off training camp 2016, and it's a very interesting year because the way that 2015 ended and the way that wild card game ended, as well as you kind of sense a different focus and maybe a little bit of a different hunger from some of the coaches and the players based on how that season ended. So aside from the approach the teams are supposedly applying, there are a number of positional battles that are going on, and that's going to be some of the biggest storylines, I think, for the Bengals. Now, since they're a deep team, a lot of it is at the back end of positional areas, but there still are a lot of roster spots that are still up for grabs, be it from free agency attrition or just other situations going on. So, Scott, I'll start with you. What's the one positional battle, one group that you're looking at that you think is the most intriguing as we go into training camp right now?
I am very tempted to go one direction, but I'm going to go a different one. I want to say defensive tackle or defensive line, just because you mentioned how deep they are, and you look at the defensive ends, and outside of the starters, you have Marcus Hunt and Will Clark, who have, in a couple years really haven't done anything on the field. So it seems like they're really shallow there. But then you look at defensive tackle, and they just have a glut of people there. They have, Deshaun Williams, who passed up on the chance to go elsewhere to play. And then you have guys like Billings, who they just drafted, and then Pecco, who seems to, be there forever, and obviously Geno Atkins, and they brought Pat Sims and Brandon Thompson, and it's just at some point something has to give. And you have Hardison who was drafted last year, so it's where are you going to put 8 or 9 defensive tackles? I'm hoping that somewhere in the master plan they have something in mind, where the best people are going to get played, and if that means someone like Billings gets a chance, I think it'd be great. I know their history says that probably isn't going to happen, but when you have that many good defensive tackles and such little apparent depth at defensive end, I'd like to think there's going to be something they're going to do to try to work that in. So seeing the schemes, the rotations, how they work that in is something I'd say to me is very interesting to look forward to.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, the Bengals kind of the rich got richer this offseason. They re-signed Pat Sims, they re-signed Brandon Thompson, they drafted Andrew Billings, so they really loaded up at defensive tackle. On paper, you look at defensive end and you say, they got a former second-round pick in Hunt, a former third-round pick in Clark as backups to guys like Carlos Dunlap, who just came into a Pro Bowl. But you're right, finding those rotational guys and those 2 former high picks, Clark and Hunt, are going to be just huge to what the defense and really what the team is going to do in 2016. So that being said, Connor, what positional battles are you kind of looking at? Actually, the one positional battle that you're really looking at as training camp opens up.
I think for me it has to be linebacker. I mean, you look, Ray Maluga is going to probably miss training camp with an undisclosed injury, we're assuming. Vontez Burfict is also one, I don't know the initials, I think it's like DFI or something like that, but he's not going to be playing. And from what I heard from sources within the Cincinnati media is that basically he's not injured, he's just not participating in practice. It's kind of Marvin Lewis's way to get around the whole, okay, well, Vontez Burfict has to play. Well, Lewis is just trying to, as we kind of saw and wrote about on the site, Lewis doesn't really want to play Burfict. Even though he's going to be suspended to begin the season, he's going to be, I don't know, maybe Lewis thinks that that Burfict's going to be rusty either way, so why not just sit him another 4 weeks or however long it is before he's back for the season. I don't know. I think it's a smart move. Burfict's going to be, as we saw in the Pittsburgh game last year, Burfict can kind of just come and return, and he's probably going to be pretty near full speed regardless of how little he's been playing. Obviously, he probably needs to lose a few pounds because he looks a little overweight, but that aside, I mean, just with Maluga and Burfict out of the picture, there's so many young and talented players that we all have been waiting to see for so long. I mean, you've got Nick Vigil, who obviously we drafted this year, so we haven't been waiting that long, but we've got Marquise Flowers, who hasn't been doing anything since 2013, so he's hurt. I think he played a little bit in 14, but point still stands. Then you've got P.J. Dawson, who fans seem to love for, I'm not really sure why, but he's got to do something, right? I mean, you figure that with Burfict and Maluga out, that these guys are going to get opportunities to play, and that's exciting. And then obviously you've got Carlos Dansby, who's coming to the team via free agency, who is he really going to still be the player that he was in Arizona? Probably not. But even when he was in Cleveland, he was one of the pretty decent. He was one of the above average, I should say, at least coverage linebackers in the NFL. So as long as you have a guy like Dansby who can cover, and then a guy like Maluga, a guy like Burfict who can thump, you should have a pretty decent linebacking core. So seeing those young players come up from behind and hopefully they can make an impact. Specifically Flowers, I think that he really needs to show something. And Jason DeMonch, who I totally forgot about. He played, I think, in like 14 games in 2013. So just these guys, they have opportunities. We just need to see what they're made of.
Yeah, I was pretty ecstatic about the Dansby signing, even though it kind of screamed vintage Bengals and Mike Brown and getting an over-the-hill productive veteran on the cheap. But I think that he'll bring some leadership. I think he's 34 or 35 years old, so obviously he's at the very tail end of his career. But at a minimum, he'll be a Band-Aid for Vontez Burfict as he serves that suspension and going forward. I do agree with both you guys. I'll be keeping an eye on that. I think we can all agree wide receiver is a group, especially at the back end, that we'll probably be keeping an eye on. But I'm going to go a little different route. I'm going to say cornerback. And the reason I say that is because there is just a glut of talent there. And there are, I think 4 or 5 first-round picks there. They also have Josh Shaw there. There's a guy they've loved, Chris Lewis Harris, who keeps hanging around. it's going to be interesting to see not only how that pecking order plays out, but how much playing time a lot of these young, talented guys like a Darqueze Dennard, like William Jackson III, like Josh Shaw get, and in what roles. That I think I think William Jackson has the ability to potentially be the best of the group down the road once he gets his feet under him. I think his athleticism is incredible. I think his change of direction and all of that, his hands back seat, especially early on, behind Adam Jones, Drake Kirkpatrick, and probably even Darqueze Dennard. So I'm really interested to see, even though I think I know the 5, if not 6 corners they're going to keep, it's not so much that, it's who they play, how they play them, how often the young guys play. I think that's all kind of something where I'm keeping a real close eye on as training camp opens up. Just some other news here as camp does open up. Connor mentioned Ray Maualuga being placed on the non-football injury list. A couple of other guys that aren't suiting up immediately, some of which are expected, some of which may not be. Tyler Eifert, who's recovering from that ankle surgery from about a month or so ago, he's sitting out. Brandon Thompson, who had a late season knee injury last year, is sitting out. James Wright, who a lot of people think could latch on to one of those last wide receiver spots, is on the PUP list as well. So those 4 are on the PUP list. Ray Maualuga is placed on the non-football injury list as camp opens up. So you won't be seeing or hearing much about those guys as camp goes on. I want to talk next, if you guys have some extra thoughts on this. The Bengals aren't usually movers and shakers in free agency in general. That's just not what they do. But for some reason, and this is something that's very uncharacteristic of them as well, they've made some moves in the form of cutting or releasing players and adding a couple here and there of late. So there was Taylor Mays, who was let go suddenly. Dyshawn Mobley, a free agent running back. Corey Tyndall was a corner that was released. And then the Bengals signed former Dolphins and Charger safety Jimmy Wilson on Thursday. So, Connor, I'll start with you this time. Any thoughts, your thoughts on the players who were released? And then I think I'll ask Scott about maybe the new acquisition and maybe what he sees coming forward. But maybe some thoughts on the players who were released?
Yeah, I mean, they also cut, I believe, Desmond Johnson, the Duke defensive end.
Yep, you're right.
Just wanted to point that out, too. But I don't know. I think it's an interesting move. I think that one of our commenters actually brought up an interesting point that basically, I mean, we have 90 people on the roster, and in all theory, I mean, everyone likes the fact that players have camp bodies, and you want to have an abundance of talent on your roster in case someone gets hurt. But at the end of the day, Cincinnati kind of knows who has a chance and who doesn't have a chance on the roster. I mean, following the Chargers, I saw that the Chargers head coach Mike McCoy, he said in some sort of interview that he kind of already makes 53 rosters in his head almost at every single significant point, whether it be the start of training camp, whether it be week 3 or preseason game 1, preseason game 2, and so on and so forth. And I don't think it's that lofty of an assumption to say that Marvin Lewis probably thinks the same way, and just the whole Bengals staff in general. So while we have guys that are going to make the roster, like AJ Green, Geno Atkins, and certainly the guys behind them are definitely not as safe to make the roster, Cincinnati still knows that it has talent. It has guys like Kumaro, it has guys like Alford, and all these receivers that we didn't really talk about earlier. That those are the guys that Cincinnati wants to see succeed and wants to see make the roster. They bring in a couple extra guys to compete, but in all honesty, like I think that even if they leave like 2 or 3 guys off the roster and just carry 87, 88, 89, like I don't think it's the end of the world. Maybe I'm wrong there. In terms of the guys who got cut, you had Taylor Mays, and we all kind of saw that. I mean, we didn't see it coming, but as soon as he got cut, everyone was kind of like, oh, well, there must have been another some sort of drug-related issue. Probably missed another test or failed another test, and then a few days later we saw he failed another test, and so he's going to get even a longer suspension than the initial 4 game suspension that he had to start the season. So. The Bengals like Taylor Mays. They want to see him come back and potentially make an impact. But at the end of the day, losing him for half the season, is it even worth keeping him around? Probably not. So, they'll either have an extra roster spot and they won't have to worry about, Mace stealing snaps from players that are actually going to have a chance to play this year, or they could, sign another guy who could probably be more of a camp body and at least have a microscopic chance of making the roster. And then they have a running back. What was his name again? Mobley? Is that what it was?
Yeah, Dyshon Mobley, yeah.
Yeah, Mobley. I wrote a piece on the running back situation earlier this offseason, and forgive me for not knowing exactly everything about Mobley, but what I do know is that even at the running back position, Cincinnati seems pretty set. And I think they understand that, the running backs that are number 6, 7, 8 on the roster really. Last year, they had, so for those who don't know, obviously Jeremy Hill, Gio Bernard, Rex Burkhead, and Cedric Pierman are probably going to be the 4 guys that stay on the roster. That's already 99% set in stone. And they've got Bronson Hill, I believe. No, Tra Carson's the guy who he's kind of the guy that was really impressive in college, and it's pretty impressive that the Bengals were able to snatch him up in undrafted free agency. He seems to me like a lock for the practice squad just because of the production he had in college and his measurables and his size, and as well as his combine or pro day, whatever it was that he did participate in. All those numbers were really good, and he had the production. So he kind of looks like a guy who's a safe bet for the practice squad. As we saw with Terrell Watson and James Wilder last year, even though the Bengals had 2 very talented players who, Watson is number 3 on the Browns depth chart now, and I think Wilder's 4 on the Bills, and maybe as high as number 3 now, depending on, Mike Gillespie or something like that, who, I don't know if point being is that basically the Cincinnati, there's no point in having 2 running backs on the practice squad. They know they have, Tra Carson, so why even carry another guy? I know there's another guy that's probably competing, and he's probably going to stay on the roster, but to me, it makes sense that they're just cutting ties with players that they don't see as players that are going to strongly compete for the roster. So, they brought in a guy today, Jimmy Wilson, who has the NFL experience to play. That doesn't necessarily mean he's going to make the roster, but at least he's going to compete with the guys at the back end and probably make a bigger impact than another undrafted free agent safety might make. That's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, and Scott, as Connor mentioned, Jimmy Wilson was the new acquisition, but the Bengals also brought in a rookie defensive end, Jack Gangwish, who was, I guess, out of Nebraska, to the fold, and they still have a couple of roster spots open. So aside from your thoughts on those 2 acquisitions and the positions that they filled, what are your thoughts on, Connor mentioned it may not be a big deal if they have a roster spot or 2 open during camp or as camp opens. What are your thoughts on that? And do you hope that the Bengals maybe make a little splash with maybe a Dwight Freeney signing, or just continue to fill positions of need regardless of the player and status?
Yeah, I think for me, I'd like to see them get hit 90. I know Carson obviously don't have to hit 90, and we probably know that. They probably know going into camp right away that here's 10 or 20 guys who have 0.1% chance of making it. But it is kind of nice from the perspective of you always hear about camp bodies, and they always bring in a kicker like a Zach Hawker or Jared Oberski, someone to take away all the reps so that, as I say, so the kicker doesn't get his leg worn out. And so, someone like Clint Bowling has someone block against, and Dunlap has someone to practice against. So they're not always going against starters. It just kind of spreads out the workload as far as some of the heavy lifting in camp during the heat of the summer. And so it's kind of nice to have those extra bodies in there for that. And then I think the other benefit of having as many as possible, as long as you're not stealing reps from the main guys, is like we saw just a couple years ago when their whole receiver core is decimated. They lost Eifert, I think, in the second drive of the season. They lost A.J. Green for a big chunk. Marvin Jones was down. They had just lost Hawkins to the Browns. So, they're pulling guys like Greg Little off the street. And this is kind of your chance to find out, hey, here's someone that, is kind of floating around. He may or may not make it, but he might be a 7th, offensive guard or something. But we kind of know that if we get in that situation where we just get totally destroyed by injuries or suspensions, I was probably more Steelers, but if we get hit by suspensions or injuries or something, that we know we have someone there that we've seen, that we know that, yes, this guy's someone we want, or no, it's not. And I think in the past they've done that with some guys who were kind of rated kind of high on draft day and then just never panned out. I think we saw with Aaron Maben, and there was someone else I think a couple years ago that did that with too, where they were, guys that were kind of highly regarded, never really worked out. I think Derek Harvey was when they brought in, who they had looked at, I think back in '09 as a draft pick in the first round. And so it's just the idea of, yeah, just bring them in, just kick the tires, and if they're not any good, then okay, we know it's not what we want, but at least you did your due diligence, I guess.
Yeah, and I've been a guy that's been saying, I don't know how long this championship window for the Bengals is open. And luckily for them, they've managed 5 consecutive postseason appearances from 2011 through 2015. But you have something like Hall of Fame offensive tackle Anthony Munoz saying he thinks that their window is closing pretty fast here. And I think all of a sudden these guys who were up-and-comers, Andy Dalton in his second and third year, and A.J. Green, who's blossoming into a Hall of Fame player in his third. All of a sudden, these guys are in their 6th, 7th, 8th years. You got Carlos Dunlap, even though he's not 30 yet, but he was drafted in 2010, as was Geno Atkins. So some of these guys need to start winning postseason games. And my point with that is, I think at some point you got to push the chips all into the table, and if it is by bringing in a Hall of Fame guy who's won a Super Bowl before in Dwight Freeney, maybe that's a guy you have, and even though he may not like the idea of being a rotational backup to the Bengals defensive end starters, if he senses a true pursuit of a ring with the Bengals, I think that's a good addition. They did the same thing with Dansby, and that kind of filled some needs there. So I do agree with you, Connor, on a lot of what you said, but I think I'm with Scott in the fact that I hope they would, at least somewhat early into camp, fill those 90 roster spots and really make the most out of the competition at each spot, really make the most out of their roster, and whether it's a splashy signing or someone that can come in and fill a niche role for them, I hope they find a way to fill that out. But still a lot to play out, obviously, during training camp and some acquisitions that they have going forward. Training camp does open Friday, July 29th, and will continue obviously on, and then they get into preseason play there. So all of the training camp coverage will be covered by probably quite a bit of the three of us on Cincy Jungle, as well as others, and we'll be also covering more of it and the developments through this show, the Orange and Black Insider. So continue to stay tuned to us. This may develop into something that may be a segment of the week called, the Hater of the Week or something like that. Obviously, it's our first show, so we got to figure out some new names and creative things. But Colin Cowherd, who is now with Fox Sports, he used to be with ESPN. He has a radio show on Fox Sports on weekdays. He's got kind of a prime slot, but he's been a guy who has incessantly been critical of the Bengals, whether it's their quarterback, their organizational culture, their coach. He just loves to bash on the Bengals. In the last week or so, he's had 2 big slights against the Bengals on his show, and one of which, when he did quarterback rankings, and now I didn't catch exactly how many he ranked. I would guess, I don't know if he ranked all of them, but I would guess he probably ranked about 20 to 25, given that some teams, their starter situation is a bit fluid. But he basically made 5 tiers, and in the last tier, the final tier, which he called Fool's Gold, he put Andy Dalton in a group with Brock Osweiler, Ryan Tannehill, and Kirk Cousins. So we'll start with that. He also made another slide about their 2016 outlook, but Andy Dalton, and I don't want to make this whole show about Andy Dalton, obviously, because that's always a hot-button topic, but aside from that, he also predicted the Bengals to go 8-8 in 2016 and miss the playoffs, having lost out to the Pittsburgh Steelers and tying their record with the Baltimore Ravens. So, Scott, what are your initial thoughts? Do you even take credence in a guy, even though he has a national radio show? Are we a little too close to the team and we have our own biases? What are your overall impressions when I tell you that kind of stuff coming out of Colin Cowherd's mouth?
I think looking back at Dalton's history, I think Cowherd might be the only one still clinging to it, but he definitely wasn't first. When you look at him when Dalton entered the draft, he wasn't physically elite. He didn't enter with a ton of hype. He didn't have, the big, tall 6'7" frame, the rocket cannon of an arm. He didn't go to USC. TCU wasn't as well known as a school. So a lot of the media, a lot of the fans didn't really know who he was. He wasn't in consideration as a top 5 pick like Cam Newton. And then when he got to the NFL, they had like you mentioned, the lockout, and so there wasn't a lot of expectation for him. The first year, they didn't really throw a whole lot. They were just trying to, get by with a brand new rookie. And so you look at pretty much what he entered into and what he did starting out, he was pretty unheralded. And then to top that off, anytime they did play in a primetime game or a playoff game, he looked horrible. So when the majority of people saw him, they only saw him at his worst, and they didn't have any expectations going in. So you end up coming away with this very negative view of him. But if you look at the things he has done, and as Bengals fans, we obviously, we get to see it every week, and then even more, the idea that, he did step in from day one. He did take over an offense that was brand new as a new offensive coordinator, new, wide receiver, starting from scratch. And what he's done since then, he's gone 50-26, 5 straight playoff games in 5 straight years. I mean, that's pretty impressive. There's not a lot of people who can say they've done that.
Right.
But unfortunately, because of, I think, how he entered the league, until he wins that playoff game, he's just never going to get that recognition. Kind of like with Peyton Manning. The guy's going to be a Hall of Famer. Until he beat Brady and finally made a Super Bowl, everyone, there were people who liked to knock on him. Or even LeBron James until he went to Miami, and then until he came back to Cleveland and won that title. There was always someone who's going to knock on him. So I think Dalton's always going to have that because of how he entered the league until he can finally, take that first step. And ideally, I could see him take 3 or 4 steps and win the whole thing, but at least that first step.
Right, and it's a fair point, Scott, about his thoughts on Dalton maybe being predicated on his draft position, given Cowherd is just obsessed with Andrew Luck. And Andrew Luck obviously didn't finish the year last year, and even before he got injured, he wasn't even having a great season. But that's his horse that he's been riding ever since Andrew Luck came into the league. Connor, your thoughts, especially not only on Dalton but the record, but especially after Dalton's MVP-like year before he got injured last year, and it wasn't really his fault that the team didn't win a playoff game because he wasn't suiting up for them because he was injured.
Yeah, I mean, well, first off, I just want to say that Colin Cowherd is one of the weirdest just I just don't understand his whole thing. He sits in. If you guys don't watch his show, which I don't, but every time I see like a clip or something on some sort of social media, he's always sitting at a desk by himself, and then his co-host or whoever else is with him is sitting on the other side of the room, and so the whole show he's talking like this, kind of staring at you from the corner of his eye. I just don't get it. Like he seems like such a strange guy. Fox is making some great hires now with Skip Bayless. I mean, what are they trying to do? ESPN is falling apart. Fox has a chance to really establish itself as a network, and then Skip Bayless and Colin Cowherd are dominating the headlines, which just goes to show that people love to hear analysis from guys who don't seem to understand the sport. I mean, NFL Network even has guys like Heath Evans and people and like Ike Taylor who just like. I love Ike Taylor, and I think that like a lot of former players have good things to say, but people love like flamboyant analysis that doesn't always make sense. And so for Cowherd, who like swore that he wasn't going to ever talk about Dalton anymore, like in the middle of last season when Dalton was playing like an MVP, of course he's going to go back to Dalton. The Bengals are an easy team to hate on because, like every other team in the NFL, they lose football games. It happens every year. The Bengals lose 5 or 6 or 7 games, and when they play in the playoffs every year, they have more opportunities to lose games. So, of course, it's going to make it easier for Cowherd to really say that because you could say that about any quarterback in the NFL last year. Even Peyton Manning won the Super Bowl. People didn't think he was that good. So, every quarterback loses games. And in regards to last year, the Bengals going 8-8. Unless you think Marvin Jones was the most important player on the offense, I don't really think it's that really, that like it doesn't make sense to predict the Bengals to go 8-8. Like, what about the Bengals makes them look like a similar team to Baltimore? Like the Bengals have a better quarterback, they have a better running game, they have better receivers, they have a better offensive line, they have a better defensive line. They might not have as good as linebackers if Suggs and Dumervil play the way they've been playing. They have a better secondary, and they have better special teams. It's like 8 categories versus 1 if we're playing devil's advocate here. And that's not me being a homer. That's just going off the past 5 years of what the Bengals have been. So for an analyst to call the Bengals an 8-8 team or 4-12 team like Adam Rank did, I just find it kind of interesting, and I don't really think it's very credible because as we've mentioned, like Andy Dalton's a great quarterback, and even if he doesn't play like he did last year, the Bengals went I think it was 10-5-1 when Andy Dalton played horrible because he had no weapons, and Jeremy Hill stepped up in the run game. I think that if like this year, if Kyler Eifert doesn't play well, if Brand LaFell for whatever reason doesn't show up, and no one else behind AJ Green shows up, you still have Jeremy Hill and Giovanni Bernard and one of the best offensive lines in football. So what's there to? I don't care about the coordinator changes. I don't really care about anything. If you look at the Bengals from a and just a neutral perspective, they're a good team. I've had coworkers who work for the San Diego Chargers say they're the team that drafts best in the NFL. So it speaks to the Bengals general management. It speaks to their coaching. It speaks to the personnel on their team. They're a great team, and I just don't understand someone. I think it's actually a bold prediction to say they're not going to go to the playoffs because they go to the playoffs every year. I mean, I don't know. Unless you think they're in for some sort of a bad year, but no one's like, oh, the Patriots are going to miss the playoffs this year. It doesn't make sense to me.
Here's my thing, and this is, I think, where Colin Cowherd, who is a national, he has to know a lot. He has to know a little about a lot of teams because he covers a number of different sports. He covers a number of different teams. Okay, so here's my thing, and I get knocked around on it on Cincy Jungle, kind of being a conspiracy theorist about it, but the problem is with the Cincinnati Bengals is they lose when it matters the most, and they lose on the biggest stages, and they lose when everybody's watching. They don't lose often, and they haven't lost often in the last 7 years. I mean, in the last 7 years they've made 6 playoffs, so they haven't lost a lot. They lose in important situations, and they lose when everybody's watching, and they lose in embarrassing fashions.
Yeah.
And I think that's what jades a lot of national media pundits, including Colin Cowherd. Now, he's been a longtime hater of the Cincinnati Bengals. I don't know if someone, poisoned his Wheaties within the Bengals organization or whatever one morning, but he has just been a Bengals hater for a long time. But regardless, I think it's the stigma that the Bengals just choke when it matters the most that has people cynical about them. And I agree with you, Connor. I think position by position, you look at the Ravens and the Bengals. I mean, the Ravens are still a well-coached team. They've got some talent, but I mean, you've seen really what that rivalry has been like since in the Andy Dalton, AJ Green era. I mean, after the first couple of years, the Bengals have utterly dominated that series. So, some of it you kind of take with a grain of salt, but it does make national headlines, and it is something that is interesting discussion going into training camp. So I wanted to get your guys' thought on that as training camp opens, and obviously as Colin continues his ranting against the Bengals there. We're going to close up shop in just a few minutes here, but one of the things we've been doing and we want to encourage with this podcast is reader activity, reader engagement, and maybe down the road we'll get a phone system and take calls once we have the capability to do so. But for now, what we've been doing is when we do these Facebook Live posts, not only to promote this program, but other stuff going on the site, when we do that, when we post about this program on Cincy Jungle, we want reader questions and we want engagement there, and we received some good ones recently from a couple of Facebook Live sessions. From a time standpoint, we won't go through all of them. There's just a couple that really stood out. One I'm just going to address pretty quickly, unless you guys have additional thoughts on it. But a lot of people were asking, things about Tyler Eifert. How are things going to look with Tyler Eifert? What's his status? What's the timeline of his return? As of now, nothing has changed. It looks like he might miss Game 1, Game 2. We don't know. As I mentioned earlier, he's on that PUP list. He's probably not going to practice for a very long time, and probably not even up till very close to the season starts. So that's kind of the status with him. Obviously, there's some stuff about why did he wait so long on his surgery. I think both parties were looking to see how his ankle reacted without surgery, and it just didn't respond well. And obviously, he needed to have that procedure done for his season to be salvaged. And I think we can all hope it doesn't turn into a Marvin Jones situation from 2014. But as of now, his recovery seems to be on track. From everything we hear, he's going to be on the PUP list to start, so they're not going to practice him. And the team's going to move forward with Tyler Kroft and C.J. Uzomah as their tight ends, along with Ryan Hewitt probably playing a dual role as H-back and backup tight end. So that's kind of the update. There's a lot of commenters on Facebook Live who asked us about Tyler Eifert. That's the recent update on Eifert as of now. So, Scott, I'm going to start with you on this one. People like, there were a couple of commenters that I noted. Linda Young and Kurt Rowe were two people that specifically asked, and this kind of goes back a little bit to our 90-man roster take, Scott. They were asking a lot about Leon Hall and Dante Whitner being added to the roster. What are your thoughts on that?
I'd say if the Bengals think they can help, I would like to see him added because it's not going to cost a supplemental pick. They're probably going to get him on the cheap. It's going to be a one-year rental kind of thing, just kind of give him the push. But honestly, from my perspective, I'd say I don't really know if they're needed, and that's something you mentioned earlier about just the depth in the secondary. You have guys like Denard and Shaw, the rookie M. Jackson III, Kirkpatrick, Sean Williams, and you have Iloka back there and Jones. You have a lot of young people, and then a few experienced people, and I think if you really want to get these young people a chance to play, and that's the one knock we always have is they don't play the guys on the defense, the rookies. They made Kirkpatrick sit 3 years. Denard has only started a handful of games. We'd like to see William Jackson play a lot this year, but just given the track record, you don't know. Well, then you add Leon Whitner back in there. And not that they would necessarily start, but it just seems like you're just perpetuating that of not giving us a chance to really see what these young. If you're using a first-round pick, let's see what these guys can do. So I guess my perspective is, if they think it can help, I'd like to bring them, but I think they have a pretty stacked secondary. I'd like to give those guys a chance and just see them play.
Just a quick follow-up question. If they brought in Leon Hall, would you prefer to see him as a slot corner, a safety, or maybe a hybrid guy? What's your preference on Hall if they brought him back?
I'd say safety only because we have so many cornerbacks already. And I know it was a year ago or 2 years ago when he was starting to decline, they talked about him practicing at safety in training camp. So
yeah.
He has some of the experience. He's always been a good tackler. I mean, he'd be a great guy to kind of defend that last line of defense. If someone breaks loose, he's not going to be Taylor Mays. He's going to make the tackle and stop the guy. So I guess that'd be my thought, just to get those cornerbacks a chance to play cornerback.
Okay. Yeah. Connor, I'm gonna give you a question here that I really liked. It was from a commenter, Brian Bowman. It was kind of a long statement, so I don't have the entire statement, but it's basically about fixing the discipline issues at training camp, obviously pointing to what happened at the end of the wild card game with Vontaze Burfict and Adam Jones, but maybe some signs to look for that has improved, and or what the coaches should be doing in camp to really it's a dangerous situation because they've basically have come out and said, the players and the coaches, we are angry about, it's past us, but we are angry about how last season ended. So it's I guess the question for you would be, how do you see them harnessing that energy in a positive way during camp, and what would you like to see sign-wise towards them having an increased focus and increased discipline?
I mean, well, yeah. First of all, I just have to say I love the fact that they're angry. If you're not angry about losing that game, then I don't really know what you're doing, because no one enjoys losing, especially in a brutal fashion like that. And as we kind of wrote about on Cincy Jungle a few days ago, I saw something about some sort of hint that basically Marvin Lewis is going to be trying to, maybe not right now, but in a little bit of time, have some of his players kind of testing Vontaze Burfict to try to see, is he gonna erupt? Is he gonna kind of start freaking out? Because, to be honest, I'm not one of the huge voices saying, the Bengals have a discipline problem. I've actually kind of been the opposite. I kind of think that it's kind of hard to control your players when you have 53 guys on a team, 11 on the field at a time, and you're not really allowed to go onto the field. Vontaze Burfict was the guy who brought the team back into the game, again, in the wild card game, and him, Adam Jones, and Jeremy Hill. And it's just so coincidental that those three guys were the guys that kind of let the team down at the very end. And that's not to say that, those guys aren't disciplined or they're not good. Whatever it is, ultimately what it comes down to is the Bengals played fewer good snaps than they did bad snaps. Or I should say they played fewer good snaps than the Steelers played good snaps in that game. Everything transpired, and people are going to believe that the referees jobbed the Bengals, and that's justified. But at the end of the day, you still have to be the team that makes more plays, and the Bengals weren't that team in that game. And so ultimately, I think it's interesting to see that Marvin Lewis is trying to do this with Burfict. I don't want to go too off the rails about Burfict because he's already blocked me on Twitter for kind of talking about a few of his plays, and I'm assuming he probably read something that I wrote because why else would he block me on Twitter? I haven't tweeted at him. So
you blocked me too. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, I know. I think he blocked everyone in the Cincinnati media, which is totally justified because you're a player, you're a person. You don't have to have people in your face all the time or bad-mouthing your name. So, but anyways, ultimately, I just think that Marvin Lewis is doing a good job with the team. People are going to say whatever they want to say about Marvin Lewis, and they're entitled to that opinion. Obviously, my opinion isn't right or wrong. It's just an opinion. But at the end of the day, after seeing the Chargers fire Marty Schottenheimer after a 14-2 season, and then they might have won a playoff game or two with Norv Turner, but they didn't capitalize on the talent that they had and even make it to Super Bowl, let alone win one. That's kind of the reason why I stopped following the Chargers when I was younger, and obviously I've gotten back into the team as I've gotten older, but I don't want to see that move with the Bengals. If you're going to fire Marvin Lewis, fire him for a coach like Belichick, fire him for a coach like Mike McCarthy. There's only about 6 or 7 coaches in the league that I think are definitively better than Lewis, and if one of them wasn't available on the market, I just wouldn't want to hire him because ultimately Marvin Lewis, as soon as he gets fired, is going to get hired by another team. We all know it because he's a good coach, and it's up to basically the fans to believe whether or not the Bengals' playoff losses have been coincidence, injury, the team being jobbed or cursed, or whatever it is. I'm under the impression that they've just kind of been unlucky. They've had a ton of injuries, and the play calling, specifically in the 2013 game against the Chargers when Andy Dalton threw, I want to say, like 50-something passes. Basically, there's just been circumstances, and at the end of the day, it's kind of just a battle between two teams, and the Bengals haven't come out on top in those games, but they've as we saw in 2015, they were getting a lot better in primetime games. Dalton was on fire. The coaching was very good. The team played well. They responded to their coaches. And I like what Marvin Lewis is doing with Burfict. I don't think Burfict is kind of a maniac on the field, but I think that it doesn't hurt to have a guy try to get under his skin and see really what he's made of and how he responds to things, especially bad calls. So, yeah, that's kind of where I am.
It's interesting that you bring up Marty Schottenheimer because I always liken Marvin Lewis to Marty Schottenheimer in that he's a guy who can build a team from scratch. He can make a poor team competitive again. He can get them to the playoffs, but his teams, in big moments, they make inexplicable errors. They shrivel in the big games, and I see a lot of similarities. And I think Schottenheimer was much more of a hard-nosed disciplinarian than Lewis is, but I see a lot of similarities with the teams there. And I hate to contradict you, Connor, but I don't think the Bengals were very good in primetime last year. I think they were if you count the wild card game, I think they were 1-4. And the one game they won was the Cleveland game where they blew them out, a very, very bad Cleveland team. And they lost to Denver. They lost the Steelers game, obviously. I mean, the list goes on. And I think to the question that we're asking from Brian, I don't know if there's specific signs that you can see that focus has been restored or further discipline has been restored so much in camp. I think a part of, and I hope that part of the reasoning for such high turnover in the coaching staff is because they want to eliminate these inexplicable errors in these critical moments. And the Bengals, in that Steelers game, they made enough plays to win, but the bad plays they had, whether they were more or as many or even fewer, the bad plays they had were at much more critical moments in the football game that caused them to lose that game. So I think it's going to come down to, I don't know if we from the outside can see it, but I think it's going to come down to coaching and really harnessing those players and getting on them about, being ready in big moments, doing the right thing in big moments, and then hopefully that translates on the field outside of Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern when they always seem to play well, aside from some of the Thursday nights and some of that. So great questions, but keep those coming either on our Facebook Live or the posts on our website when we post these shows. We want your guys' questions. We want to answer them every week, and that's one of the segments we want to do every week on this show. We're going to close up shop here, and before we do, I'm going to tip my invisible cap to Scott here. This is a segment, at least for this week, a little bit of bold predictions. He's been doing a lot of these posts on Cincy Jungle that have, some of which are a little more reasonable, some of which are a little outlandish. Scott, I'm gonna be honest with you a little bit, but they're interesting nonetheless, and they're a great series. So I will kick it off. Scott, I'm going to let you go last since this is your series. I'm going to kick it off, and I'm going to say a training camp bold prediction will be that at the end of training camp and maybe into preseason and even the regular season, I think Rashawn Simoniz is going to be the team's primary kickoff return man, with Adam Jones also sprinkling in there. So that's mine. Connor, let's go with you.
Oh, man. You didn't give me time to think. Let's see. We're just talking training camp?
Yes.
All right. Training camp bold prediction. I'm going to say, oh, man, you kind of took mine because I was going to say Simoniz makes the roster. It's okay. I'll think of another one. I'm going to say that Uzomah outplays Tyler Kroft.
That's a good one. I like that one. I think Uzomah has the athletic ability. Definitely. That's a good one.
The preseason. Yeah. He also outgains him, scores more touchdowns.
I like that. All right, Scott, this is your baby here. So, training camp bold prediction here.
I'm going with. I'm actually staying with the offensive skill positions, and I'm going with wide receiver. That I think when they break camp, Jake Kumerow is going to be the number 4, at least on the depth chart. I think we all know Green, Fell, and Boyd are probably the 1, 2, 3. And then if you look logically, well, Tate and Wright should be the next 2 because they have the experience. Alford and Core would be the next 2 after that because, they were draft picks, and so you're not going to, give up on draft pick that easy. So it's already 7 guys there. And then Kumerow is fighting Simoniz, who you have, make in the kick returner, so he has a roster spot. Then you have guys like Grant and Erickson and Bennett and Russell all fighting for that last spot. I think when it's all said and done, just his size, his skills, the fact that they've been saying he's catching everything thrown his way, and with Eifert out, he gives you this big 6'5" target that is really nice in the offense. I think he's going to work his way to number 4 and maybe even number 3.
I like it. Yeah, I mean, he's been turning heads, and it's been the second year in a row. So he started in training camp last year turning heads, and then obviously in spring camps this year, as you mentioned, he's been doing really well. So very reasonable. So those are some of our bold predictions in training camp. Once we post this on the website here, leave some of yours in the comments. We'd love to see some of your training camp bold predictions, as well as some of the thoughts on the other segments. If you think Colin Cowherd's a nut, we'd love to hear that too. Anything else that you want to discuss, leave it in the comment thread. And obviously, like I said, if you have other questions, contact us. You can also, aside from contacting us on our Facebook Live posts or our Facebook page with comments that we will address on the show, you can contact us, as I said at the beginning of the show, on Twitter at BengalsOBI. On Twitter, so follow us. We'll be posting material there, and obviously a lot of Cincy Jungle stuff. Keep it to Cincy Jungle to follow some of the best training camp coverage out there. We'll be pumping out material incessantly, so keep it there. Guys, I appreciate the time. Any final thoughts on show number 1, Scott?
19-0.
19-0,
forward to
love
that.
it.
All right. Yeah, it sounds like Connor's agreeing with you, right, Connor?
I mean, well, it's possible. I'll say that.
Well, I appreciate you guys coming on and doing this with me. Obviously, this wouldn't be possible without you guys coming on board and helping me out with this. I'm excited to get this kicked off, and thanks to those of you who download and listen, and we'll be keeping this podcast up and keeping it pumping out to you guys throughout training camp and as the season goes on. So for the Orange and Black Insider, I'm Anthony Cosenza. For Scott Schultz and Connor Howe, Houday, and enjoy training camp.